the latest Madaxeman.com army list podcast. This week I'm joined again by Dave and Richard, and we dive into a matched pair of armies. We're looking this time at the Crusades era, and more specifically the Ayyubid Egyptians led by Saladin and the Later Crusaders led by Richard the Lionheart. These are two of the most epic, famous, historical, movie-worthy armies of their time, but they do seem to get relatively little play on the tabletop. So we've got 6 lists for you, 3 from each side, and we dive into a bit of the history as well, a bit of the figure selection, and think about how to possibly even use them in a competition as well. So sit back, enjoy the podcast.
This means war.
Well, look, welcome again. This rolling series of podcasts about armies, which are maybe not as good as they should be, but are quite popular, continues. I'm joined here again by Richard and Dave. And last time we did the ancient Britons and the Caledonians and the Scots in a sort of historically, geographically appropriate pair. This week we're doing a matched pair. We're going kind of a bit back to the 100 Years' War format, and we're looking at 2 armies from a little bit earlier than that, which were classic foes, but neither of which you see all that often on the table, and we're trying to pick some nuggets out of both of them. So what we're looking at this week is the Crusades, and more specifically the sort of second half of the Crusades in the book. And that's the 2 lists we're looking at is 187, the Later Crusaders, and 199, the Ayyubid Egyptians. So these are the armies of Richard the Lionheart and of Saladin, 2 of the legendary leaders, one a legendary leader of English British history, one of the great strategists of all time in some ways, a uniter of various different dispersed lands and successful ejector of the Crusaders from the Holy Land. But it's an interesting period. I guess part of it is almost starting by that artificial division with the early Crusaders as well. But the Later Crusaders starts in 1147 and runs to 1300. But it obviously it covers multiple different Crusades. But in terms of the different things which happened over that period, how well do you guys think the list actually reflects the history, the armies, the variety of Crusades there, and the local kingdoms and the other ones? Because there's some interesting troop types, isn't there?
Yeah, I think you get quite a lot of flexibility. It is quite a lot is happening over that 150 years. Through the Allies, you get the options of bringing in the French and Germans for the Second Crusade. I think then you could debate whether you should have more distinction for times when there is an actual crusade going on, where you have a lot more powerful presence of, say, European royalty, versus times when it's more just a local Crusades army, as at the Battle of Hattin in I think it's in the 1187 or whatever it is, in which case the Holy Orders quite often play a more dominant role, and their role did increase over time. I mean, they were almost non-existent at the beginning, and by the end they were major landholders.
So that almost would be one of those dreaded early Roman list notes that could get misinterpreted to say, if it's a crusade, you should be using more impetuous knights. If it's a non-crusade period, you should probably be having a smaller number of the impact knights elite to represent the holy orders. That's presumably how you do it. But I guess then the army actually naturally scales up and down quite well. It could support, this list would do a small force or a major host going to a big battle.
Yeah, exactly.
And that list of allies is pretty eclectic, isn't it? There's a lot of history going on there. I've even my kind of limited reading knows about the local Arab allies and the factionalism and the infighting even between Crusader cities that work with some of those older ones. But sort of the Byzantines, and the Armenians particularly seem kind of, interesting ones in that sphere of influence. I don't know, how much the, was this the Comnenans, is that when that was sort of a rump state, or was it still a substantial state reaching down into Syria at that point in time?
Comnenans are more involved with the first crusade, I would say, but I'm not that they fought alongside the Crusaders, but they fought, I'm not even sure what happened between 1163 and 1169. Wow. There's been one of the Crusades where the Comnenans got involved.
Well, one of the big changes, of course, is in 1204, when the Crusade gets redirected, I think, by the Venetians, and ends up conquering Constantinople itself. And you get that in the Eastern Latin Empire list, 189. It is a period of very fluid alliances, and as you see there from some of the date options, some only exist in a single year.
Exactly.
So once the Crusaders had been on the ground for a few years, yes, there was a religious element, but politics often trumped religion in who was siding with whom. And then right at the end of the period, you even get the Mongols appearing on the scene. And you have several changes of government on the Muslim side. You get the disappearance of the Fatimids, the rise of the Ayyubids, then the Mamluks, all the independent emirs. So it's a fascinating period. It makes a great setting for a campaign game, because you can have lots of little armies as well as a few big ones, and every so often a big European crusade turns up for a few years and then tends to ebb away.
Yeah, because then
having a total Mongol ally in there, maybe a few loose Mongols as an option would be more of a appropriate, but it gives it a lot of flavour, doesn't it?
Actually, yeah, adding a couple of Mongol horsemen in would be kind of interesting. And then there's that sort of unique period of Richard the Lionheart when the sergeants and the crossbowmen get changed for these sort of mixed formations, which it's literally it's a 2-year period. Is that almost recreating one particular battle, or did he actually come up with a different way of fighting, or is that just representing more close integration between the two in that particular period?
Yeah, no, it very much reflects his tactics for the Battle of Arsuf, and which was a march down the coast, trying to relieve various cities and trying to then push on towards Jerusalem, because Saladin had previously kicked the Christians and the Kingdom of Jerusalem out of the city. And, to some degree, it then prefigures in the communal Italian list the rise of these mixed units. Whether he created them or copied them, I'm not quite sure. It's interesting as well that he's made a strategist in the feudal English list, but he's not a strategist here. Whether that reflects the falling out with Philip Augustus and the tensions amongst some of the nations, I'm not sure. But it seems a bit unfair that he's named and yet he doesn't get his strategist the way he does in the other list.
I think whether is this one he lost though. If you're in a list where you only commanded the army for a couple of years and you got beaten, it probably is a bit tricky to call you a strategist.
Well, he was never beaten. He won all the battles, but what he failed to do was capture Jerusalem. But he could win the set battles, but because of the supply and logistics issues, he struggled to take the city. But he did win the right for pilgrims to enter, the Christian pilgrims to enter the city. And that's when he decided to head back to France.
I guess, objectively, much as we all sort of love him with our English hats on, if you're going on a crusade and you come up a little bit short on the capturing Jerusalem front, that probably does slightly disqualify you from the top honors, doesn't it? That's not particularly perfect. In fact, that mention of Arsuf, that's really kind of pinged back a memory from probably almost one of my earliest wargaming days. I might even still have it on the bookshelf somewhere. I had a battle games book of, I think there are about 3 or 4 of them, huge, bigger than A4 hardback things, really quite thin, that had about 4 or 5 games in them. And there was a Knights at War one, and one of the battles was Arsuf. I will definitely dig it out. That's a kind of a moment of history. That may be one of my kind of earliest wargaming, proper wargaming things. And you had to shuffle along the coast with trying to keep your Crusader force intact while the enemy kind of picked away at it with their cavalry.
Yeah, it was the Society of Ancients Battle Day a few years ago. So there was a lot of updated research and some good army lists and scenarios written in Slingshot.
Didn't he form a box and have all his baggage in the middle and shuffled along? Isn't that the one?
Yeah, well, it's very much about the use of spears and crossbow combined, and then short, well-controlled charges by the cavalry, by the knights, to drive the Saracens off, as they would call them.
Yeah. And I guess that, you know, that division between impact knights and impetuous knights, that's your sort of textbook way that these battles got fought, isn't it? You know, the knights were tempted into rash charges and then drawn out and defeated piecemeal, and sometimes, you know, that difference between impetuous knights and impact knights is quite clear. But is that sort of a Hollywoodization of it? Is that a genuine way it worked? You know, because Hollywoodization, there's been quite a few films about it as well.
I think that I disagree with the Holy Order Knights always being impact and the non-Holy Orders always being impetuous. I think what you tend to find is that any knights who had been in the Holy Land for a long time very clearly understood the need for control. Otherwise, you got mobbed by the Saracens.
Yeah.
Whereas knights that were fresh from Europe and perhaps had a false sense of cultural superiority would tend to sort of charge and regret it. And the Holy Orders were, you know, sometimes very gung-ho, and even if the knights were well drilled, their leaders were very brash and rash. So I think you can make an argument for any of the knight figures to be impact and any of them to be impetuous.
Yeah, well, maybe that's...
I think that's right. I think that's good. But I think having them as impetuous gives the real flavour of the Crusades and that situation where they were. I mean, there's the story from the Monty Python history of the Crusades of the first time on the first Crusades they met. The Arab horsemen were riding mares and the Crusaders were riding stallions, and the mares were in heat, and the horses were chasing each other backwards and forwards across the fields rather than knights or Arabs.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure quite how you include well, actually, a set of rules that's going to include that sort of stuff. I'm not sure I want to be playing, to be honest. Really,
Perry Jones' idea is that the battle was conducted by the horses and not by the generals.
Not by the generals themselves. Okay, all right. Well, look, you know, I think that's a little bit of a romp through the history. Let's move on and look at some of the lists.
This means war.
So look, what we're going to do is we're going to run through the Crusaders first, and then move on to the Ayyubids. And I think it's fair to say, or certainly when I put my list together, it was kind of in mind of this as a matched pair, which is something that we'll talk about a bit later. But Dave, we got your list up on screen first. Your Later Crusader. It's got initiative of 2. Difficult to get much more, I guess, with this particular list, unless you go really big on one of the allies. You're a decent 23. You've not used all the command, actually. It's got command of 3. You've used command of 2, and you've got a 6, an 11, and then an allied 6 as well. But look, talk us through what's in each command and what your philosophy is on it.
Okay. Well, I've resisted the Richard the Lionheart option of going with the mixed units. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a bit. In fact, I know we will. So I've gone for it's an army I've fought against when the French wargamers like this army a lot. They seem to use it a lot. So you've got basically a command of spear, the commands of knights. I've gone heavy on the knights, knowing we're talking about a match pair. And I think it's, you know, and what I've done with that is I've used a feudal French ally in command 3, which then gives me medium knights impetuous elite. So I've ended up essentially with, I was almost at 8 impetuous knights elite, but I've come close. 1 is not elite, and that's just a matter of getting the points into the army.
I suppose that's something I think that, I'm trying to remember what one of the other lists was. Maybe that was my 100 Years War French, when it was kind of, this army gets medium knights elite, so take a lot of medium knights elite because you can take a lot of them.
Yeah, that's the idea, is to just ride down the opponents. I've put in command 1, which is quite small and as a knight command, I've also put one of the military orders impact knights, and that's my included general, just so he doesn't run off and get himself killed by advancing on his own too quickly. So you've got a little bit more control over him. If I'd had the points, I'd have got more of the impact elite, but I think I wanted to go strong on knights. I would put the 2 knight commands together, and spears on one side to control, you know, hopefully you've got a bit of terrain or something like that to, you know, to hold it. And basically the idea of the spear command and the crossbow command is the crossbow sit in terrain, the spear sit beside them, and you hopefully can just hold that wing against shooting and things like that while the knights do their stuff. And
so that crossbow command, you've got 4 heavy spearmen with armor, which is an interesting one to look at. You've got a couple of sergeants with crossbow. You've ducked the Pavis, I see. You've got a textbook mediocre bowman to give that 3 shooting, and then a kind of a lightweight mini cavalry command, which of a Turcopole, a light horse Turcopole, and a light horse impact Bedouin. So that's sort of 2 commands, isn't it? With your brilliant general, you do say you see that on a wing very much.
Well, you've got some options of combination here. So you can put the brilliant commander on one wing, and you know, put the shooting on the outside, and combine it with the light horse bow, the medium cavalry bow, 2 crossbowmen and a mediocre crossbowman. Just, you know, so that maybe the general goes with the cavalry command and they split off, just to sort of dick around, as we use the sort of, we seem to have got in setting, and just slow down the enemy's approach. And I want to try and get quite a bit of shoot. I mean, the crossbowmen are going to be good against any cavalry that are coming by. You want the spearmen to protect them, and yeah, essentially 2 commands. Or you've got the option that you split the 2 knight commands on either wing, and use the medium cavalry and the light cavalry to go and aid one of those and give them width and ability there. So it's kind of flexible. You can put the brilliant commander in the center and use him to operate the light horse and the cavalry out to one side to aid one of the other commands, give them a bit more oomph. Or you know, with the right terrain, you want to maximize all your hitting power and put all the knights together.
Yeah, well, certainly, 4 knights in the first one, and then 4 knights in the other one. 8 knights impetuous, most of them elite, is pretty pokey indeed. And 6 spearmen is going to do across the French, and the other one is going to do quite a lot to support them. Did you think about this one in terms of how it would fight an Ayyubid list particularly? Is this, you know, where are you on that sort of spectrum from I'd use this generally to this is kind of optimized for taking on the Ayyubids?
I think it's pretty optimum for taking on the Ayyubids, because you've got all the knights and you've got a few cavalry to support the knights and give them a bit of width in that. And
yeah, I suppose once you get up to eight of the knights, that ability to sort of pull them apart starts to erode a bit. It's just a bit too wide to pull apart.
The feudal French commander's got to have a couple of spearmen. I'd rather have dropped them. Or I did think about in one command having just one of those spears mediocre, which would have given me a few more points to create more knights elites and things like that. Maybe another impact knights elites. But you know, I'm hoping that the pips, the feudal French command will have enough pips to keep the spearmen trolling along behind and keep them up. And if you've got that chance of combining the spearmen with the knights, that's a great thing. Or getting those spearmen with the brilliant commander's spear to combine it up to make a bit. but I think this is the standard way to use this army. And this is, I've played this army in competition against French players, and they find it very popular. In fact, the French players go much heavier on the spear, in actual fact.
Interesting. Richard, what's your thoughts kind of looking at this one and picking it apart?
Well, I think it's got a lot of strength in that, it's got 12 armored units. It's got another half dozen units that can stand in the line of battle. So 20 gives you quite a lot of frontage. I would be a bit nervous, if I'm an Ayyubid and I'm looking at that and I'm seeing that so many of the knights are impetuous and so much other strength is in the spearmen. My strategy is going to be to try and slow the spears down and throw light horse in front of the knights, hoping, because they're both ordinary generals, eventually they will throw a 1 and they'll probably be off to the races, or a 1 or a 2 and they'll be off to the races. Yep. And it's not so much that you need to split the knights up, but you need to separate the knights from the spears, because that exposes one end of the knights at least. And it also allows you to then perhaps mass your Ayyubid heavy cavalry against the spears and send them round the back of the spears. And so, and you're basically going to look and divide and conquer, because you can't face the knights frontally until they're damaged.
I absolutely agree with that, and that's very historical and works. I think the counter to that is that if they were just 4 impetuous knights on their own charging forward, they would get separated from the other commands. But when you've got essentially 8 knights, that becomes a lot more. That gives you a much larger frontage to drive the enemy off. It gives them less chance to float in front of you, sting like a bee, so to speak.
Yeah. So just looking at kind of the mass there on that feudal French ally, and your point about width, Dave, you've got 56 points there in 4 knights and 2 spear. You could have 6. I think you could have 6 impetuous. Could you have 6 impetuous knights there? Just normal medium knights in a. You're allowed 10 in the Crusader list, and normal impetuous knights are 10 points each. You've used 4 in the first command, so you could use 6 of them, just 6 knights in that last command with an included unreliable general, get the same effect. And you'd have 6 knights instead of 4 knights, and 2 of them are elite and 2 spearmen. But that would be, you'd be absolutely betting everything on red with that, wouldn't you? You'd have 10 knights in a row, and that would be just go away and deal with it. You'd lose a bit of flexibility on the spearmen.
I've tried to make as many of the knights as possible elite. I'd even, that last one which isn't elite, I would even, as I say, you could drop one of the French spearmen and make that elite and put some points elsewhere. I think the elite knights are even more bulletproof. I think there's an argument to drop one of the French spearmen and get some more light foots. The feudal French can have a light foot in there. I think the light foot are much better at protecting the knights and getting them to the point of impact. You've got probably 2 rounds of shooting by the Ayyubid mounted bowmen before the light foot are killed, and that way you're probably getting your knights stuck in, or at least that's the hope.
Yeah, that's the hope. Okay, interesting. Right, let's move on to the next one.
This means war.
So Richard, here we are with yours. You've got 1191. You've gone for Richard the Lionheart. Hooray! Fans of the Disney film will be delighted, I'm sure, as well. And so you've got, you're 23. I think the same as Dave. You've got a 5 of 14. Guess who's commanding that one? And then a Syrian ally here that's snuck in with a little 4. So So I'm guessing a lot of it's about that big 14 in the middle. But talk us through these three commands and how they work on their Initiative 2 army as well.
Well, here partly it's about flexibility. So again, I can have 8 knights together if the terrain is appropriate. The idea of I thought I liked the idea of the armored spearmen, but I also found them in the end too expensive. So because I wanted to have that mixed heavy spear crossbow, and this is very much an army designed to fight Ayyubid. So what I would deploy them is probably spear mixed, and you're hoping with the firepower of that.
Sorry, just jumping in here. Is this the right one? Because you have to replace all the sergeants.
No, you have to replace. I thought
sergeants with crossbow got you.
No,
crossbow. Bing.
It's easily done. Lots of people think that about this list, and then they realise there's another way.
All right, I'll cut that bit out, and I'll go. Actually, sorry, just looking, Richard, you've got. Oh yes, I see. Looking at the list notes here, you replace all of the foot crossbowmen, don't you, with the mixed foot? But you can still have the heavy spearmen. I bet that's a common mistake people make with this list, actually. Yeah, no, I almost pulled you up on a dodgy list there, but no, that's absolutely right. That's all fine. Carry on. Yeah.
No worries. Yeah. So,
no worries.
So you're sort of pushing the whole idea of this is to push with width. So you've got a spear crossbow block which can advance rather than just holding. You've got 8 knights, and then you've got the Syrians which can flank march, which can redeploy from any position to any other, because they move quite fast. And I think they would be particularly useful sitting on the outside of a knight group to protect an open flank. In each case as well, I've attached a light horse to the knights. The idea of that is if the opponent is careless, the light horse can whip out behind him and stop him evading while your knights crash into him. And their sheer presence means the opponent is always reacting to that, so they can't be as aggressive with their mounted shooting. So it's all about being able to advance on a width rather than having to hold back part of the line. But there's enough speed and control that I can do that if tactically the terrain forces me to.
So it's always tempting, isn't it, to try and you sit in front of a mounted type army, and your first thought is, can I shove this off the table? And here you've got, so what I always think my thing's always the combat frontage. So against a mounted army, 4 knights and the light cavalry impact, that's kind of for frontage of 5. The light horse should find something that's better than that. The central one, you've got 7 of the spears and mixed foot, and you've got another 4 knights, so that's another 11 to add to your 5. You're at 16, and then probably there's 3 of those other ones which in the Syrian ally that are combat troops as well. So you're up to 19 in terms of width, which is pretty good out of 23 of stuff that's happy to get stuck in and get fighting. Even the light cavalry bow elite are possibly push you up to 20, so you are 2/3 the width of the table there, but still that's 2/3 and 1/3 is left out, and all your shooting is concentrated in that central command.
Yes, there is a bit of shoot, but you can't have everything. It's like there's I've deliberately dropped the medium foot. I would want to go for a fairly open terrain, but it's the reason for taking the Syrian ally is that doesn't have to line up base to base with the others, which just allows you to have a more than 20 as a floating frontage. With a few 1 or half UD, you can probably control a frontage of 24, and you'd hope to have some terrain down. In a matched pair competition, I might well go for the desert. If I won the initiative, or to defend in the mountains, just because I suspect my opponent will have more medium foot than I will.
If you were doing the the textbook Battle of Arsuf along inching along a coast, is that something that you choose to do with this army? Because I guess then you've got that challenge of, do you drop the spearmen next to the coast, in which they're a bit of a waste, or how do you drop that if you're doing Arsuf?
Well, I think you have the C and C's command furthest from the river. You probably have the Syrians acting as with the impetuous knights under Richard's direct control, and I would probably have the Syrians as an advance guard and the Holy Orders as a rear guard.
Right. Okay, so that's it. Right, so Dave, what do you think of this one compared to yours? Are you just thinking, sod it, I'll throw knights at it, or
no,
if you're in a civil war?
I think there's similarities in the terms of we've got a small cavalry force of Arabs and things like that, because I've got that with my brilliant commander. I like the fact of Command 1 has got the 4 medium knight impact. They've got a lot more control over them. They're not going to ride off ad infinitum. I would worry about them not having any light foot with them, because I think they will get shot at. I think in this period, medium knights are much more susceptible to bow fire from cavalry. So I think they need some light foot to go with them. I think the mixed foot units are really good. However, there is an issue that they can't charge cavalry, as I remember. I'm pretty sure of that. So you have to, I mean, I've used Byzantinos. They've just got to keep moving forward. In essence, they're kind of bowmen more than spearmen, if that makes sense. They can receive a charge, but they can't kick out. I think I prefer having the crossbowmen, because the crossbowmen move as fast as the knights and work in combination with the knights. But that's my, one of my preferences. No one's going to attack, so you can kick out. If you've got cavalry bow coming towards your knights and you've got the crossbowmen working with them, the crossbowmen get the +1 against mounted, and they're going to keep knocking down the cavalry. But
so I suppose it's always a toss-up, isn't it, with when you've got these big sort of spear and shooting formations, whether you make it too dangerous for any mounted to come to. You almost want to draw mounted into a combat in some way, don't you? But then again, these spearmen are all mediocre, and there's only 3 of the sergeants to do it. So it'd be a nice looking formation, certainly on table as well, wouldn't it? It would look.
Well, I think, as you say, if you make it quite tough for the point is, where does the enemy cavalry go?
Yeah.
If you've got foot crossbow with spearmen, well, they don't want to really attack that. Yeah, they could sit and shoot at it, but they're probably going to get the worst of it. And even if the spearmen are wounded, ordinary bow cavalry won't want to charge wounded spear, because they're still 0 to 1.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of forcing them in front of the knights, because they have to go somewhere. And that's kind of my logic, is that you don't leave the enemy cavalry happy to sit anywhere in your frontage. And that kind of puts them on the back foot. Yeah,
it sort of squeezes them out somewhere, and your army's getting on to being wide enough that there's not much space left for them to go to concentrate on anything else then. All right, well, that's an interesting one. On to the next one.
This means war.
Okay, then, third Crusader then list. I've ducked the Richard the Lionheart again, partly just my normal bloody mindedness to try and pick something a bit more weird, but partly I think just looking at it, we talked about it in your list, Richard. I suspect I misread that restriction on Richard the Lionheart, which is an easy thing to do, to think that I had to change all the spearmen as well. But there's an element of this which is similar theory to yours, but with a slightly different balance, and it is again that same sort of theory that you don't want the knights picked apart, but you are going to probably have to shove this enemy army off the table in some way, shape or form, and push them forward gently. So what I've gone for is absolutely maxing out the infantry, which is a very sort of similar way to the way Richard's doing it, but instead of concentrating it in one command, I've split them across 2. So mine's also initiative 2, competent, ordinary. I get up to 26 because, again, I'm working on that theory that there's not a massive amount of punch in the Ayyubid army, but it's going to be maneuverable. So, and the width is the answer to that, because it is going to, all those cavalry are going to drop on table and zoom to concentrate on one point. So I'm just being reasonably tough across the whole board. So what I've done is that first command. Well, the first two commands are very similar, really. The first one's got 5 of the mediocre heavy spearmen. Big fan of that troop type. Couple of the light infantry bow, which is a little bit scary to shield 5 heavy spearmen with, but there's also 2 crossbow pavis in there that can kick out an awful lot of shooting, and I guess the light infantry bow do kick some out as well. So you've got a frontage of 7 there across the sergeants and the crossbow. The crossbow can kind of either be split up or sit together, possibly even go into some rough terrain. That's a frontage of 7, and then you've got 2 medium light impact. One's elite with an included general, so that's 9 wide of, you don't really want to take this on with medium or heavy cavalry unless you're kind of bold. The second command is almost a mirror image of that one, or copy of that one. 5 sergeants, 2 crossbowmen. I've only got the points to give one of them pavis here, so there's 1 pavis, 1 without. 2 light infantry with crossbow, and then the extra bit here, because this is the CNC and he's not included. I've got the 2 medium light impact, which are not elite this time. They sort of either extend the line or they can sit behind, and if the spear line sort of wants to create a gap, you can drive the Crusaders through it. And then just a kind of super comedy, tiny dicky about little extra command to look for a flank or look for a gap or chase someone down if they're trying to run away from it. A Turcopole medium cavalry bow and a Bedouin light cavalry impact. It's just an extra maneuvering element to chase people down. So from my 9 wide in the first command, this one's got 5, 7, 8, 9 with the Crusaders, and probably 10, 11 with the Turcopole and the Bedouin. So these first 2 commands are putting a frontage of 20 down. And then I think this is a direct copy of yours, actually, Richard. It's well, nearly a direct copy. It's another Syrian ally to maneuver and hopefully get out there to stop the Ayyubids kind of squirting away from this real grinding press from the rest of it, with an elite heavy cavalry Turkish Gulam with an included general, heavy cavalry bow, 2 medium cavalry impact, and a light cavalry impact as well for, I think, almost exactly the same 4 for a 26. So in this theory of doing this as a match pair, this is almost downplaying the knights to play that game of sort of paper, scissors, stone of what does the enemy expect you to turn up with, and this is expecting the enemy to turn up with cavalry and have them expecting to face a relatively small punchy knight-led army, and then find that they've got a broad, kind of pseudo-Russ army that's going to try and press them off the table, ideally doing that Arsuf thing and marching up the side of a coastline or a river and just saying, look, this is big, it's wide, it nearly covers the whole table. You don't desperately want to be doing anything about it, but almost to tempt heavy cavalry or medium cavalry lancers to having a go against it with those mediocre spearmen and just sort of suck them into a bit of a war of attrition. So it's kind of doing the same sort of thing as yours, Richard, but with a different balance, partly downplaying the knights a bit and using them more as a reserve at the expense of extra width, and partly because I suspect I misread Richard the Lionheart bit about the mixed archers, because they are pretty good, and I might try and want to squeeze them in. But then again, crossbow pavis is pretty cool, and the figures look nice if you're doing that as well, which is always important. So I don't know, what do you guys think of this one? Do you think this would give some Ayyubids reason to scratch their heads?
I think my Ayyubids would prefer to fight this army than either mine or Richard's army. I think you're right. If you notice the Richard the Lionheart, I think the idea of having the spear pushing across the table works. I think the Ayyubids are going to be much more happy shooting at mediocre heavy spearmen than shooting at spearmen with armor. And the fact they're mediocre gives them a bit more susceptibility. So they do become a target. I think if you want to use the mediocre heavy spearmen, I think you almost need a few more crossbowmen in the groups, because you need to be able to shoot as you go. You've got to put the pressure on. The crossbowmen get the +1 against the mounted, and that helps them. I think that helps you put the pressure on and force the cavalry back, especially if you've got some mounted, there's medium impact cavalry in these armies, and the Ayyubid armies. You need to be able to making them a target. You've got the width. I think the Ayyubid armies are going to be very happy to try and pick on the Syrian group, or ignore one part, ignore one part of the spearmen, pick on another part of the spearmen, try and pick off things one at a time. But it's fine. I mean, you're much, much larger than the Ayyubid list that I've created, much larger.
Yeah, and it's kind of that sort of suck them into a war of attrition thing. And it is always there's a real question. Do you go with fewer, better quality spears or more crap ones and just accept some casualties and build that in between the difference between sort of, the 22, 23 and the 26? You've got a bit more ability to absorb those sorts of hits, but and you're giving, if you're too strong, the enemy daren't attack you, and that's a bit tricky sometimes as well. I don't know, Richard, this is very similar to your list, but slightly different. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I can see two distinct pluses of this list versus mine are the extra width, or three in fact. The extra width, you've got no impetuous knights, so you haven't got that control issue. And if you had a big piece of central rough terrain, you could put 4 crossbowmen in it, yep, which aren't brilliant rough terrain troops, but I've got nothing. So you've got 3 distinct advantages. The disadvantages, I think, are that without so much relative firepower or as many knights, if I'm the Ayyubids, I'm going to stick medium impact lancers in front of one of those spear commands on a flank, hope to shoot you down a bit, and almost force, because if I can force your spearmen to charge me by pressuring them in some way, contact, we're 1-1, you're mediocre and I've got furious charge. Yep. So that is going to be what I would then try and engineer against it. And with 10 of those, and because they're mediocre, as I say, you're not quite able to push the Ayyubids as much. You at some point are relying on pressuring them with your width to force them to attack you. And if you can engineer that, I think you'll win the game. If they can engineer forcing you to attack them, the Ayyubids would probably win.
Yeah, and I think I did debate about how to spread those 4 Crusader knights around, because they sit in the front line, which is kind of the no-brainer, I will try and fill the table way of doing it, or they almost sit behind and you do that kind of ta-da, the curtains part, and the spearmen speak, and suddenly the Crusaders come through a gap in the middle, which does give you the ability to drive people off, because a line of medium cavalry lancers, even if it's 4 wide, is going to be quite unhappy if 2 medium knights charge into the middle of it. They're still going to give them a huge problem, and then that maybe gives you the option for the sergeants to come in. So I'm looking at it saying 5 sergeants with spears, 2 with crossbow, so it is kicking out a reasonable amount of shooting. The likely both sort of help, and then if the Crusaders can come through at the right part, maybe as a reserve, and as you say, terrain, this kind of 20 plus wide is sort of based on being on a desert billiard table, but if you do get a few pieces of terrain, suddenly they're running out of spaces to be able to concentrate on, and you've got some ability to deploy reserves there, which which makes it kind of more interesting.
Yep. No, good.
Yeah, Dave, any are we done? You did I ask you before?
You did.
All right, fine. We've done that then. Okay. Right, so that's good. So let's move on and turn on to Saladin's side of it.
This means war.
So Richard, let's start with your Ayyubid. You've gone with the great opponent to the great general in your Crusader army. Saladin is leading this army as a strategist. It's got an initiative of 5. Whoopie-doo, that's remarkable. 22 units, which is a nice solid number. A 9, an 8, and a 5. No allies here at all. And I'm looking at a very long list of different troop types in each command. I think your 9 has got 8 different troop types in it, so it's going to take us some time to go through that. Do you want to kick us off and start talking us through how this list is put together and what it's going to do?
So my philosophy was having, very much in the matched pair sense. So I'm thinking, my opponent's got knights and spears and some foot shooting. But what he doesn't have is command and control. So my strategy is going to be to maximize command and control in order to kind of play find the lady and be able to really shift my point of pressure dramatically throughout the game. So again, that means no heavy foot, having a little bit of rough terrain, but it's quite rubbish, really. It's a mediocre medium spearman and 2 bowmen, one of which is mediocre. But it just means that if there is an awkward piece of rough going, I am at least able to kind of pin my opponent and slow him down from exploiting that. In each case, it's really a question of trying to tempt my opponent forward and hit him in the flank with impact cavalry, or whether that's light, heavy, or medium, while at the same time keeping up a constant barrage of shooting, preferably against that part of the opponent that doesn't have foot shooting. So, up against his knights, up against his light foot, maybe up against spearmen, but trying to avoid, because I'm not expecting my enemy to have more than 4 or 5 reasonable foot shooters. But again, I've gone for quite a lot of elite to try and make those shots tell. Because if I can make a non-elite medium knight wounded, well, then my heavy cavalry impact is just as good, but has 1 more life left.
Yeah, it's a real mix with this army, isn't it? Whether you look at it as an impact mounted army or as a mounted shooting army, and I think that's an issue with some of these. Well, a lot of these Arab type armies, they've got the ability to drop cavalry in as either troop type, but you end up working out, have you got the right numbers, and what's the right number of cavalry bow to stick together to be powerful, or cavalry impact to stick together to be powerful. So in that first command, you've got 3 heavy cavalry bow and 1 heavy cavalry impact there.
Yeah. So the whole idea, that's the reason for going for the high points. So all the mounted bow would be in one movement group, and the impact cavalry would be in another movement group. And the idea would be to hold the impact groups back, maybe behind bits of difficult terrain or something like that. Use the bow cavalry to shoot up the enemy, encourage the enemy to come forward, fall back with the bow cavalry, and look for opportunities to hit on the flank with the impact cavalry. And particularly if the enemy has a lot of impetuous knights, you can really pull them forward. In my experience, most people will, if you're falling back, most people will come forward. And so, they'll watch their flanks, that they'll protect things, but you're hoping that command and control, all you need is that one turn where the opponent throws a 1, and even if I do, I should have the movement for all of my groups. And so that it's very much, it's a different kind of war of attrition. I'm doing it with movement and command and control rather than cohesion points.
Seems very very reminiscent of that Byzantine game we
Yes.
played recently. I think it was my Arabs being mad charging forwards at that time. Was it? I just wonder if these command groups have got 3 heavy cavalry shooters and then 1 heavy cavalry impact and a light cavalry impact. Is that giving you enough impact? You've got heavy cavalry impact elite. Did you consider trying to swap that out for a couple of the medium ones, or do you just want the quality of the army?
I'm not planning to try and hit frontally. I'm trying to engineer a situation where I'm pinning the enemy to the front with the bow cavalry and hitting them on the flank with 1 heavy cavalry impact with a light cavalry impact to add a +1. And I went for the heavy cavalry impact because if I'm hitting knights or armored spearmen, I don't want them to have that extra saving, because and again, it's why I made some of them elite. That flank attack has to work. And you'd be hope if they're on 0 and you're on, 1 for cavalry, 1 for a flank, 1 for impact, 1 for a friend, you could be 4-0 up. But you really want that to be crushing, because you ideally want to kill the enemy at contact.
Well, there is that. There's a weird thing that I think I've only noticed in the last sort of week or so with, I think it's page 58 about Furious Charge. We all know that Furious Charge cancels armor, if you've got it in the first round. But there's a sort of slightly odd one that, so if you're heavy cavalry impact charge armored spearmen, if the heavy cavalry impact lose, they get a +1 for having better armor in the first round, because Furious Charge ability still cancels armor. Yes. So armored cavalry against armored. As soon as you say it, it's obvious, but I guess you don't get many times when heavy cavalry armored troops charge into other armored troops and lose, really. It's just a slightly odd one. So you're actually more resilient than you think.
I thought it was the armor doesn't apply if you're affected by Furious Charge. Depends what the word.
I think if you look on, this was one that was pointed out to me just this week, actually. It's on page 58 in the right at the bottom of it. It says the armor and heavy armor abilities do not apply during the first round of melee if the opponent has the Furious Charge ability. So you could actually cancel heavy armor. Armored troops, it's amazing, isn't it? But it comes into effect very rarely. So that is our reason for the heavy cavalry. Maybe means they can actually have more of a go of even charging spears frontally sometimes.
And another one people forget is that if heavy cavalry hit the flank of heavy spearmen, they're on a basic factor of 1, not a basic factor of 0.
Yeah,
and that can also makes a huge difference.
Enormous, isn't it? Yeah. Absolutely enormous. So you've got these multifaceted. Going back to the list, you've got these multifaceted commands, and I guess the second command is sort of the first command, but without that rubbish medium foot bowman spearman group, I guess.
Yeah, it's just got a couple of light infantry, because again, I might be going for a desert, in which case they're able to go through the sand dunes quite happily, or I might go. If I win the initiative against the Crusaders, I might put a mountain terrain down.
They can whiz along.
Might suit me.
And then that third command is kind of unusual, with 4 light horse in it and 1 heavy cavalry. So is this one of your either on table or off table flank march commands, or?
Exactly. By having and that. You might think, well, gosh, going for a competent, but the whole point is it gives you a 12 range for moving the light horse. So I'd definitely be looking to be able to throw some of that light horse behind the enemy and threaten his camp, which again always puts people off. So I'd be, I could move the 4 light horse together if it was warranted, or I can have the 3 shooters together. And 3 elite shooters, if you can sit on the end of a line, that starts to get a bit nasty.
That's a bit nasty.
And light cavalry impact hitting anybody from the flank or rear. Again, it's not a lot of points, but it has a lot of potential.
Yeah,
But if
no,
you
I see that.
march it, you're not going to miss it too much.
No, and Dave, you know, I can see straight away there are, you know, there are two things you're going to love about this. You've got a block of a bowman and a mediocre bowman, so you're happy for that. And what else? But you're also going to say that that third command should be 4 instead of 5, so you can stick it in ambush, aren't you? Especially with a strategist.
I'm very much of that argument. You'll see it in my list. I think the interesting part about this is there's a lot of expensive troop types in the Ayyubid list, and that makes it difficult when you're fighting against all those knights. If you've got the Mamluks, they're 13 points. Essentially, they're the same price as a knight, and they've got to do at least 1 hit before they can, you know, at least 2 hits really before they can start thinking about fighting the knights. I think so. The issue you've got is you want all this command and control by having strategist and brilliant, but the difficulty you have is keeping the numbers of the army up above even 20. I think Richard's done a really good job here. The one great benefit he has is he's not got any medium cavalry in there. You'll see from my list, and I'm guessing, I haven't seen yours, but I'm pretty guessing that yours is going to have a lot of medium cavalry impact.
Oh, I love medium cavalry. I think they're amazing value. The only problem is these ones can't be made mediocre, which is my favourite troop type. But yeah.
But having fought medium cavalry, you know, I've used a Byzantine army with medium cavalry, and it got mown down by the Lionheart, half crossbow, half spear. They just walk across the table, and every time they shoot you, they hit.
Are you fancying your Crusader list against this one? Or are you looking at this going, this might be just a little bit too squirty to get hold of?
The one, yes, I do fancy it, because the one thing I worry about there is Richards has put some terrain troops into the army, which is the 3 medium infantry. I would worry that because they're mediocre and bowmen and things, heavy infantry must march into terrain if it's rough rather than difficult. Obviously, it will march in and kill them. So I'm not sure they've got, you know, they can slow down somebody with some terrain there, but I'm not sure they've got the full option to hold it too long by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, my list, I've put a few more impact in there. I've, you know, taken that risk with the medium cavalry. I definitely think command 3 should be 4 rather than 5, but then that's just my choice.
Yeah, no, I must admit, looking at it, thinking with the head up, you know, as if I was commanding my own Crusader army, I'm looking at this, and I think, as I inferred when I was asking some of the questions earlier, I'd be kind of relieved to only see 2 impact heavy cavalry, because with my army of a comedic amount of mediocre spear, I'm much happier trying to throw them into a war of attrition against heavy cavalry bow, even if they can evade. It's the impact cavalry that become a problem, as you've said, to drive away and push away. But you know, there's a lot of elites, there's a lot of armor in it. You've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so elite heavy cavalry there, which is still almost as good as impact and is a lot better than mediocre when it comes to a war of attrition. So it would be a really, really interesting matchup. But you know, let's move on and have a look at the next one.
This means war.
So Dave, we're on to your Ayyubid. We just had a discussion about ambushing commands of 4, and your army of 21 appears to be a 4, a 13, and a 4. And you've got Saladin as the strategist. So you've got, straight away, I know that you've got 3 ambush markers to hide your 2 small commands in. But you've only got an initiative of 3, which with a mounted army and a strategist seems quite an achievement. You've got competent strategist and ordinary, and 13 in that middle command. So other than, you know, the default of they're all going to be an ambush, tell us how you've put this together, what you're thinking you're going to be facing in a Crusader list.
Okay, so we've talked about mini commands. I think I'm going to put down command number 1 first and put it very wide on one side of the table. and hopefully,
And that's two elite Mamluks heavy cavalry bow and 2 elite Turkmen light cavalry bow. A textbook,
exactly.
pokey little shooty command.
And it's got a command. It's got a competent commander included. It's difficult not to include commanders, and I would have loved another brilliant commander, but what I've ended up doing is 2 micro commands. Now that first command, I'm hoping somebody's going to match up quite a large command against that, and then I can turn and zip off to somewhere else in the table very quickly. What I'm kind of hoping for is a piece of medium terrain 1/3 of the way into the table, something like that, and I can put that micro command out there and then rush that behind the terrain, get it to the other side of the table so I can gang up with my good troops on one side of the table. In the second command with the strategist,
actually, sorry, just sort of thinking about that, because again, that's something you did in the game we played, that Byzantine Civil War, you can watch replayed on YouTube as well. And it is that point of, in Art de la Guerre, there is 6, 7, 8 turns before the game is resolved, usually, and the delaying a big opponent's command by just giving it a lot of distance to cover before it can actually get involved in fighting is a very, very legitimate tactic. Space and time really neutralizes quite a lot of the army. You can really gang up on stuff in these rules. You don't have to match people all the way across the width of the table, which is a mistake I think all of us still make occasionally. But yeah, no, and that's a good command for running away from it. But your Saladin command with the strategist, your 13.
Well, I've got, it's kind of very similar to Richard's army. I've got I did look at having an entirely mounted army, and I found that was a real struggle to get to, and I had too many medium cavalry in there. So the strategist command, essentially, I've bulked up on the medium troops, but there's a bit of thought in that. I can combine my medium infantry in terrain together. So I've got 2 medium swordsmen impetuous and javelinmen to give them width, and a bowman. So
3 javelinmen, that's a lot of javelinmen, isn't it? That's getting to your...
There's another thought I'll come to. Hold that thought, because there's another point in that. So I could, if the terrain is my way and I've got some terrain to dominate, to hold down one wing, I can get together a 6 wide infantry unit, 1 bowman, 3 javelinmen and 2 Ghazi. At a push, I've got a strategist to control the Ghazi and make sure they keep in control. But the other option there is that I use the ambush ability of this army with the strategy of 3 ambush markers to put the Ghazi into an ambush. And what you could actually do, and I've used this before, is have the 3 javelinmen on their own working together as one group. Now, if I was fighting your spear army and I've distracted the knights, that you can put those 3 javelinmen together and they can hold up one entire command on their own in the same way that light horse, but they can also pin troops, they can move, slide, and they can fight into the flanks. So they can actually form a kind of, you could actually put down the strategist first, put 3 javelinmen very, very wide, and have Saladin and the rest of the troops quite a long way away from them, so they can operate as one. They can operate as one group on their own, and I think they're a great delaying troop, even against.
Then you've got a pretty pokey cavalry command also under Saladin. This sort of 2.5 sub commands command under the strategist with 3 medium cavalry impacts. See, you've seen the light, fantastic. 2 Mamluks elite heavy cavalry bow, and then a 2 heavy cavalry impacts. So you're going for that. You've got 7 proper cavalry, 5 of them are impact, and 2 of them have got bow. So that's quite an aggressive force, but that's going forwards, isn't it?
Well, the idea here is that what I want to do is combine up all the heavy cavalry bows together. So you've got 2
from the first command and 2 from the middle, yeah.
Basically 8 heavy cavalry bow, which are much better at fighting against bowmen in the open because they've got the armor ability. So if they can go forward as a group, they can pin, control enemy knights, pump out a lot of shooting, and then you want to keep the Kurds and the medium cavalry impact behind the lines, or get them to get them into that, you want to if you can create a V and evade in a certain way and pull the knights into those charges, you want to try and get those options to get the medium cavalry and the heavy cavalry to, as Richard was saying, to operate into the flanks.
Yeah, because all these commands work together, don't they? Because you've got that third command, which is a Khwarezmian ally of 4 heavy cavalry bow. One of them's elite with an embedded general, and that's actually quite unusual, isn't it, to see a mounted command with no light horse. So because it's all heavy cavalry, it can join up very neatly with the heavy cavalry in the center command, or the 2 heavy cavalry in the first command, and make it, as you say, you get 8 shooters and then 5 impact cavalry as well, which is a pretty decent width, but it does pump out a lot of decent shooting with the 5 of them are elite shooters, 3 of them are ordinary shooters in heavy cavalry. That's chucking out quite a lot of stuff.
It can also operate in the same way as Command 1 and be very, very wide. Because it's allied, someone else is going to not want to come up and spring it, until they really have to, especially because or 1 and things like that. So you can offer it out there. You can put it a third of the way of the table in and say to the opponent, if you want to operate against that, you're going to have to make it reliable. You're going to have to come forward. And then hopefully, again, like the other one, it can spring off into the same position. Or it can come vaguely down the center of the table, shooting as it goes, and with the other 2 commands bringing their 2 heavy cavalry bow in to support it, to give yourself that 8 shooting, and hopefully that's as wide as any knight command.
Yeah, well, it's going to dish out, it's almost better shooting than either of those infantry formations that me and Richard are putting together. But Richard, what's your thoughts on this one?
I think it's got a lot of flexibility. As Dave says, you've got an allied command, but chances are your opponent would have to spring it. It's, for me, I would have preferred 1 or 2 more light horse in one of those commands, because if you have Saladin on one flank, you're kind of then hoping that there is a bit of terrain for the javelinmen to hold. I think the Ghazi in support of the impact cavalry against foot could be good. But I think that the danger with them is that they end up forcing you to attack when maybe you wouldn't want to, because the strategist has got quite a lot to do there, because the cavalry are likely to break into 2 groups. You might have to manage the Ghazi. That would be my worry, is that you're asking Saladin to manage a lot of troops, some of whom are impetuous, and they're all different combat roles.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. They do all go forwards, isn't it? I suppose looking at how you would or could shuffle them around in a different way, maybe there's an argument that the heavy cavalry bow and the light cavalry bow, almost that command 1, would be a better second sub-command for Saladin to command, as well as the infantry, because it can sort of run away and it's not got loads of complicated things to do, whereas the heavy cavalry impact are going to need quite a lot of someone's attention to get them in the right place. You can get them wrong if they get in the wrong place. Maybe there's a question about swapping some of that balance around, but then again, if that, I've still got that vision of 8 heavy cavalry bow in a row, 5 of them elite, and thinking, my mixed shooting formation moving up to that is probably outgunned, which is, because 8 heavy cavalry in a row is just a big number, isn't it?
I think that gives Richard the Lionheart's, having been trounced by what we call Scutatory, the half and half spear and bow units before, I think that, having all those heavy cavalry bow gives those guys a bit more thought, a bit more issues.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking I probably need to rebase and repaint some of those mixed bows up, actually, because they do feel better the more you look at it. But no, that's
they're not allowed to charge.
No, but
they are allowed to charge if the unit they're charging is in support.
Yeah. True.
So what you do is you hit them with one spearman, and that allows everybody else to go in. So you close to less than one base width, so the charge is free. You charge with one spearman, and then the rest are allowed to go in.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, actually, if you get close, it's free points, isn't it?
I agree with what you're saying about this list of having, you know, splitting the medium troops into one command. But I think having those two micro commands gives it a lot of flexibility. I think I really like that idea of, you know, and if the Ghazi have to be left to go and charge into something stupid, and then you have to sacrifice it, you know, you can get some more command control, but you know, 21 is much better than 20 in an army size.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, definitely. And actually, I think if looking at it the other way around, if you do look at both mine and Richard's Crusader lists, we're both there with stodgy width, and this is an army that is just absolutely going to concentrate on one of those commands, and the stodgy width is going to struggle to do much about it, because those two micro commands can just leave acres of space empty and leave a line of spearmen looking a bit daft quite quickly, really. And that's one of the great things about it. So it's thinking about it as an army that redeploys and has a lot of punch in one particular area. And then I guess once you throw the punch in, you're committed and you're rolling the dice, and you're just trying to avoid the knights. I don't know how it would fare against yours, particularly. You'd be trying to avoid your own knights, wouldn't you, really?
Well, I would use the javelin men in front of the knights, because the javelin men, okay, you know, you keep them, say, 5 away, but the javelin men march up to stop the knights double moving, and then they turn around and start moving back towards their base edge. And
yeah,
those 3 javelin men can occupy 6 spearmen, maybe 8 spearmen, or, you know, 6 knights. They can, you know, you've got 21, what was it, 24 points in it.
Yeah,
you're just, you know, you mess around.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting.
Your opponent gets behind them with a light horse.
Yeah,
True.
that is tricky.
Then you go and kill the light horse.
Then you try and kill the light horse. But look, an interesting list, and let's move on to the final one of the 6.
This means war.
Right, well, look, into the final furlong here, as we come up with the 3rd of our Ayyubid list and the 6th list in this particular podcast. Now, this is mine. Again, I think I've probably fallen a little bit victim to the try and be a bit over clever, but then again, this matched pair format does actually allow you to do that mental game of paper, scissors, stone a little bit more, with a little bit more confidence that you know what you're fighting against, and maybe that's something we should talk about a bit later on. But what I've done here with an Ayyubid list, I've ducked Saladin, tempting, but for what this army is, I didn't think it quite was necessary, and I've got a rather chunky 26. But everything about this list is thinking that it is going to be fighting a Crusader list, which has been optimized to fight the theoretical Ayyubids. And I think, Richard, probably your list and my list are kind of the textbook opponent that this has been designed in mind of. I mean, my thought process was the Crusaders will worry about having their knights being picked apart and the rest of it, so they will go heavy on the bow and those mixed shooter formations and the rest of it. And there are, to beat the Crusader list, not to outmaneuver it, but to just get in there and beat it and have a good old crack at it, which is kind of a lot of my play style, you are going to need to defeat a chunk of spearmen and mixed spear bow to really crack it and also catch it out as well, to do so quickly, rather than, you know, your theory was about developing into one area and redeploying. This is like, oh, I've caught you on the back foot. So what I've got a 13, a 4, keeping Dave happy, and a 9. And the 13 and the 9 are both run by brilliant generals. The other one's an ordinary included. So the 4 is the simple one to talk about. It's a textbook, small, delay, sneak round a flank, maybe an ambush, maybe a flank march command that you can live or live without. Reasonably pokey though. 2 Mamluks, heavy cavalry bow. One of them's elite with a general. There's a medium cavalry bow Turkoman, because that gives you a bit more shooting cheaply. And then a Bedouin light cavalry impact, so that this can bully anybody else's 4, on the assumption that other people's 4 is too heavy, too light. And the light cavalry impact is going to match up. So that does what it does. That's probably the most textbook straightforward. The brilliant C&C, this is my pile into a line of spear command. And I'm thinking that people will either have the mixed spear crossbow, or they'll have possibly the mediocre spear just to get the extra width. So I've gone for the 4 normal ordinary heavy spearmen that you're allowed in this list to upgrade to ordinary from mediocre. The 2 Ghazis, medium swordsman impetuous, a javelinman just to accompany the Ghazis, possibly, and to make this a decentish rough terrain force, to make it 3 if that has to go 3 into the medium, into the rough terrain. I've stacked up the light infantry bow to protect the spearmen from any shooting on the way in, or possibly give overlaps in rough terrain. So there's 3 light infantry bow there as well. So you've actually got 7 infantry if you count a javelinman as a combat with a screen of 3, and then a little kind of supporting mini cavalry command of a heavy cavalry bow Mamluk, an elite light cavalry bow Turkoman, and a light cavalry impact Bedouin that again can support them on a flank or screen them or whatever, to give you some extra width and operate whilst that main command is just trying to charge at what what I suspect the Crusaders will think is a solid-ish wall that can sweep forward with reasonable impunity. And then the other side of it is again doing a similar sort of thing. And I think there's an implicit assumption again in this design that nobody in this match pair is really expecting much terrain, or is wanting much terrain from either side. So this is an army that can throw out a reasonable number of patches of terrain and get that I think what's our cliched phrase, the bow motorway, the strip running down the middle of the table that suddenly becomes a problem for everybody. The 2 javelinmen here could operate with the Ghazis and the other javelinmen in the first command, giving you a block of 5 if they operate together. You've got a Dave special, a normal bow and a mediocre bow together to operate that. So you've got 4 infantry that can go in terrain and do stuff. And it's not great, 2 javelinmen, 1 bow, 1 mediocre bow, but it's better than anything the Crusaders can really put into terrain. So you can use terrain to force flanks and break up their formation and cause them problems. And then a couple of medium cavalry impact. There's a light infantry javelin as well to support that thing. 1 heavy cavalry bow, a couple of medium cavalry impact, and a light cavalry impact Bedouin, which again is sort of pushing at other people's command of 4 sort of shooty stuff and just trying to chase it off and charge it down, whilst that central command looks to, or sorry, that first command just looks to try and dismantle one of the big commands of bow and spearmen quite quickly before the other sort of flanks cave in. And it's sort of a delivery system for that, and something to exploit rough terrain. And it was trying to do this list a bit differently, because when I was trying to pull it together as a textbook Arab Muslim mounted cavalry army, it does sort of fall into that trap of it's maybe not as good as some of the others because it doesn't have a Death Star and it doesn't have the De Lama, and then you end up with a pretty bland 21 that is just the same as lots of other lists. So I was trying to get some of the unique flavor of it and try and think of a way to attack how an anti-Ayyubid Crusader army would be put together. So it's got a bit of lateral thinking in it. It's got some unusual stuff, but something that can exploit terrain and something that can go frontally into a line of kind of crappy spearmen. That's really what I was aiming for. I guess if someone turns up with 10 knights, it might be in a world of hurt and hiding in terrain, and running around a lot. But against the other two, I think it could give them a good old go. Was my theory. But what do you guys think?
I think it's. I mean, obviously the size is helpful. The fact that a lot of it moves at, a lot of the foot moves at 3 is helpful because you can stay out of the way of a lot of the knights. But it is reliant to a fair degree on having a fair bit of rough terrain. And if your opponent gets the initiative and goes for mountains or desert or something, you could be pressed, or just if they end up being able to deploy such that their spearmen are not in front of your spearmen, I think you've got a world of pain, because then your spearmen are probably facing knights. So it's one of those ones where almost you win or lose before the first move. It's all about the terrain and the deployment, and that can be true of a lot of armies. But that would be, I think there's a lot going for it, but that would be my concern. And because it's got the heavy infantry and so on, your ability to redeploy, I mean, yes, one of the small commands, mounted commands, could redeploy, but your infantry are fundamentally going to be where they start the game. They're going to stay there. They're not going to. No,
absolutely. And I think it is just hoping that, or assuming that you can get 1 or 2 bits of terrain in decent places, and looking down that Crusader list and saying, this is a list that has got nothing to do, no ability to deal with terrain at all. So in the kingdom of the one-eyed javelin man, the 3 javelin men are kings, or something like that, to cook up the world's worst metaphor. So this is partly, as I say, playing paper, scissors, stone against a Crusader army that I'd already written first, and partly there's sort of one way to do these mounted Araby armies, and to come up with a different way of doing it, you've got to take some risks and bend some normal rules and make some assumptions as well. But it was just thinking, this would, if you were your Crusader list and suddenly a load of normal spearmen and impetuous swordsmen and somebody who can exploit rough terrain kind of plonks down in front of them, suddenly you're like, oh, I didn't expect that.
Definitely.
And I think my own Crusader list, this is where that theory I had of the 2 knights in the Crusaders coming in as a reserve or coming through the line would suddenly work a lot better. But if they've all been pushed over to flank or pushed over to one big block, and the terrain falls correctly, so I guess knights would probably want to stay away from terrain. It's trying to set up the table such that there's an obvious place for the enemy knights and there's an obvious place for the enemy spearmen, where you've got these not one-dimensional, but I guess troop types who are very different, spearmen and knights. You can often find a place, and you've got commands which are dominated by one of those troop types. It sometimes does become a bit easier to anticipate the enemy deployment.
I think that's a very good point, and it is one of the arts of generalship, is being able to read the ground. And in a game, you can actually manipulate the ground to a degree to be what you want it to be.
You can not only read it, you can rewrite it as well.
Yes.
Edit it, cut and back, do a bit of cut and pasting or something like that. But Dave, you're looking quizzical there. I think other than telling me my mediocre and average bowman is good and the commander 4 is good, I'll take that as a given. But what do you think?
I think you're going to put the cavalry in the centre, I assume, and then you've got 2 brilliant commanders on either side, which are going to be capable of doing a lot of manoeuvring. I think Richard's right. You are dependent on terrain. It's going to be vitally important, and if the terrain doesn't fall right for you, you have got some issues. One thing I think we're both being really critical here. I think
I'm not putting this up as a fantastic all-rounder list. I think it's a, how do you make this list different to anticipate the way people might play Crusader. So you're setting two constraints on it there, and saying, you know, could this give really mine and Richard's lists a surprise and a challenge?
I agree. I mean, having 26 and 2 brilliant commanders is a benefit in itself. The one thing I'd fear is the 4 spearmen. I'm almost tempted to say that heavy knights might have a go at those. You know, I mean, like, the knights are down in the first round, but they're armored, quite possibly elite. And once they're in, you know, contact, they can win on the, you know, as long as they don't drastically get ripped up in the first round. The other thing I was going to say is, you've got light cavalry impacts on their own in 3 commands. My experience of light cavalry impact is, it seems like a damn good idea because they're up on the impact point when they're fighting light horse, but it tends to be that they get shot first.
It never works, does it? Yeah.
Yeah, if you get light horse impact, I think at least 2 together works better. So what I might do is put the Turkoman elite into command 2 to make it all shooting and elite, and then bring the 2 light horse impact together with a heavy cavalry. You know, that works better. But that's just me. That's the way I.
No, actually, I'm looking at that, and I think it's another one of those easy list traps, isn't it? You think, if I stick a light cavalry impact, it will be better than the other guy's light cavalry bow, and that will help me. But you're right. There is a real quality in numbers, and this is a list with 1, 2, 3, 4 light cavalry in it. But yeah, putting them in 2 2s rather than a 1 and a 2 would be better, because then you're just saying, right, 2 light cavalry impact, or even 3. It's like they are going to mug something, rather than you relying on a +1 in 1 round of combat to do all the heavy lifting for you. So yeah, I think I probably could, with the benefit, particularly of having seen your army, Dave, that last command of 4 heavy cavalry or 4 heavy cavalry bow. I think it is just that paper, scissors, stone, and a block of, whenever you've got light cavalry, you think you've got to push it out to the wings. But having a block of 4 heavy cavalry can still do that, but it can function much better in the middle. So with the benefit of having seen your list, I would probably shuffle around the cavalry to get one of those, because there's a group of 4, or 3 or 4 in each of those commands of mounted troops. And I would probably shuffle that to have one that's more light horse heavy, and one that's all heavy cavalry heavy, and one that's, you know, a bit of a mix, rather than the three mixes, which are all, in retrospect, possibly, for an army that's so, it's got to go in and hit the right target and hit it hard. I think possibly my 3 blocks of cavalry are all a little bit too Swiss Army knife. They're out of kilter with the philosophy of the rest of the army, possibly. So that might be a way that I would tweak this to try and put it down and do that. But it's really as we say, an attempt to make this army differently and make it play differently. And if you were Richard the Lionheart trying to creep down the coast of Arsuf, and you've designed your kind of moving fortification to creep along the coast and fend off harassing attacks from light cavalry with bows, having a chunk of spearmen and swordsmen just charge straight at you and try to fight your spearmen might cause you like, oh, that didn't work particularly well. That would be an interesting addition to the Battle of Arsuf, a heavy block of 6 people who are prepared to completely stand up and fight against the Crusader infantrymen.
This means war.
Well, look, that's covered that list then. I think one of the 2 things that we tend to do, or we always tend to have a chat about the figures, which I think we should do. And I think it's an interesting question with this period that from 1100 odd or so, you're sort of on that cusp of going from Norman style knights to more cliched medieval knights by kind of 1300-ish. What are your kind of views on on what these figures should be depicted by? You know, you can always go Hollywood and go for the fully sort of caparisoned and military orders knights, and that's straightforward. But where on what I see as sort of a spectrum from Norman style knights with kite shields to the more is it the heater type shields to the full comedy medieval knight from the Monty Python films, where does this army sit? What should these troops look like?
So I think at the beginning of the period, Second Crusade, you're very much Norman style, except that most of the knights would be in chainmail, for what is it, cap à pied, from head to toe, with probably more of the flat top type open helmet rather than the pointed Norman style starts to come in. The fully enclosed great helm is more around the 1190s, 1200s. So if you're doing the Third Crusade, with Richard the Lionheart, and from then on, you are talking much more, that sort of
cliché,
typical full chainmail knight.
Yeah.
And I think there was greater use of the horse barding in the Crusades, partly because it helped against the shooting, and so I think I would go for that full horse barding, particularly for the knights. Again, they wore the surcoats that really came in the Crusades to help cool off the armor, to stop it becoming so hot. So that's where that emerges. So I think, by default, I would go for all of that. If you were doing something particularly for the Second Crusade, then you could go for more of the Norman hybridy types.
Yeah, I think it's, the early Crusade is a Norman knights with a surcoat. I think it can get a very colourful army. I think the silks and costume drama of the Crusades is where a lot of the colour came in from Europe into Europe. This could be a very colourful army. I think there's almost a gap in the market for. I think we've got to pick. In figure manufacture, we've got Norman knights in mail. Then we almost leap too quickly to the 13th century, where we've got a collection of small helms and helmets and things. But what we really need is a sort of figure in between. I'm not sure Essex do an awful lot of knights, and they're the default one to go to. But in other manufacturers, you almost want a figure which can be a crusader, whether it be in Spain or in the Middle East, who's got, as Richard says, the smaller helmets with a nasal piece. So it's a mailed figure with a surcoat, but without the great helm.
With a flat helmet, yeah.
It's that pillbox hat.
Exactly. There's a real gap in the market for that. Having just done this Spanish army, which is in essence is a largely Crusader army, there is a gap in the market where we don't have that figure.
Essex do some nice ones in 28mm, I know at least. Yeah. I've got a few of those, and they work very well with the Italo-Normans.
Yeah.
No, I must admit, I always try and stretch my two dragons Normans into the early Crusade, and then flip into a much later period, and then sometimes I try and sort of jam a few Merleton communal Italian, but they've got a very distinctive kind of sort of almost British Second World War Tommy type hat.
Yeah, the kettle hat.
The kettle hat, which is
very relevant for this. It works quite well for the Crusade.
Well, some of those Merleton ones have got surcoats then and kettle hats, but not that sort of square pillbox one, which is a challenge. But and then obviously from the other side of it, is there something more specific about the Ayyubids, or is that into that kind of slightly, I'm not quite sure the word, where in which manufacturers produce generic Arab ranges and that's actually reasonable? Whether there was anything specific about Saladin and that era that you would want to represent in an Arab army figure, or whether you could, about horse barding or particular styles of hats or anything. Is there any reason to think they'd be any different to anybody else?
I think my Arabs I've done as, I bought Lego Heroic and done as a generic. I started off with I wanted an Arab army for Fog Ancients, and I did the dynastic Bedouin army, and that basically morphed into any possible Arab army you need, because you've got a combination of heavy cavalry, medium cavalry with lance, and then you've got the gulam with the bow, and those essential 3 troop types make it essential. And you know, in my Bisley draws, there's essentially three draws of Arab troops, whether in, you know, that goes from gulams to heavy cavalry to Kurds to medium cavalry Arabs to light cavalry with lance, light cavalry with bow on a very occasion, and then all the heavy infantry spear, medium infantry spear, and bowmen. You know, and I think that range of Legio Heroica covers all that and does it really well.
Actually, yeah, Legio do some of those interesting sort of the Turks and the Kurds and things, which are halfway between Arabized headgear, but with sometimes kite shields or other different sort of shields, because I suppose they're separate shields anyway. But they do a few more of those kind of halfway between the two figures, which fits maybe in some of these allied forces that we've not looked at. But okay, I can put a gap there. The yeah, music. The other thing that sort of strikes me, and I don't know what you guys kind of think in doing this exercise, and maybe, you know, thinking back to the 100 Years' War one as well, what we're doing here is digging out, or setting out to dig out, some of the less popular lists. But the idea of maybe for, I don't know whether it's a club competition, whether it's too difficult to do on an actual 1-day event or 2-day event, but these match pairs is a really interesting challenge to pull up lists where you're using something that's not as popular normally. You're restricting yourself an awful lot to the choices, and you do know broadly which army you're going to be fighting against. You know, I know we've done competitions down the club running over a number of months in which we've had sort of a mini league or something, but I'm just wondering if there's scope for a matched, you know, a list of matched armies that you could say either bring them along to a 1-day event, which may be a challenge, or over the course of a few months, you're just picking from any of these combos, whether that just gives people a slightly different challenge and a more historical flavor.
I think it would. I think it's particularly a more historical flavor. And I think what's interesting is quite often some of the most popular periods, like 100 Years' War, or the 2 we've just looked at, or the ancient Britons and Romans, aren't always the most successful open competition lists. But when you match them up, you're much more able to focus on their strengths against likely opponents. So I think it gives a more rewarding game, you know, in a different kind of way, and it sets yourself a different kind of challenge. But I would be up for it. I mean, some of the competitions, I think, you know, campaign often has these very tightly themed, where you only have a choice of 4 or 5 possible armies, and I always find that much more interesting in a way than knowing you could face anybody, because then you end up having to create almost a generic Swiss Army list type army. It's much more fun if you can truly play rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah. Well, I suppose with actually, but once you get down to 2, there's sort of a completely different dynamic, because with campaign, with the choice of 4, I think the last time campaign ran, I think I took Egyptians, New Kingdom Egyptians, in a tight period, and I think we played 7 games and I fought 6 New Kingdom Egyptians, which you know, that there's a challenge, and then there's a challenge, really, isn't there? But just saying, you know, down, if maybe we should you know, go offline and come up with a list of these matched opponents, maybe to give us an agenda for some of the stuff going forwards, because it's an interesting format, but to kind of put that out there and say, here is a list of 30, 40 textbook matchups, and if you're playing a game or a competition, you pick, the 2 of you agree to pick one of those matchups that you can do, and all the games in the competition have to be from that, but it's kind of a ladder or a league or something. So it gives people some flexibility, that they're not forced to bring hundreds of armies along, but it just creates a different framework for it to make it more interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly fun if you both get to play each army. You know, you play red and they play blue, and then you swap round.
Yeah,
it'd be great if you know, like we do in. I mean, I know this would be difficult with the Central London one dayers, because I think 4 games in one day is a stretch for anybody. But if you had 4 games in one day where you did 2 of the Crusade and 2 of the Arab and swapped around, that would be really good fun.
but I'm not sure, honest Dave, I'm not sure I'd want to play you twice in one day. Would you'd be playing different people, would it?
No, play different people, but
Play different people, right? Okay, yeah.
you have to do the Crusades twice and you have to do the Arabs twice.
Yeah.
And vice versa. It would create another dynamic in that way. I think, in essence, what you're actually doing is actually pitting a troop type against another troop type, which in itself has got a lot of fun angle to it. You know, if you did, as we did the earlier podcast with the ancient British against the Romans or something, that you're essentially saying, right, this is how impetuous barbarian infantry fight Roman impacts infantry. This is, you know, you're setting it up. And in this, you're actually making people play spear against each other, which is interesting.
Yeah, which is unusual. Okay. Well, look, I think there's some interesting ideas there. We trotted through some interesting and again some of the less popular in even in themed or, you know, in period competition, never mind open army lists, but found some good nuggets in them. And we will go away and pore over the army list books and consult them again. So if anybody out there's got any suggestions for lists or match pairs of lists they'd like us to have a look at, get in touch with us through Facebook or website or YouTube or whatever. And if you're listening to this on audio, don't forget to go onto iTunes and upvote us on give us a review on iTunes. Ideally 5 stars, unless you think it's rubbish, but you won't have listened to the end if you think it's rubbish. So we're probably safe on that one. And with that note, we will leave you again as we both, all 3 of us, ride off down the coast of the Battle of Arsuf and wave at circling clouds of horse archers harassing us on our way back to our normal days. Goodbye.
Bye.